Lieutenant General Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov was declared a traitor without a single witness to his surrender. He vanished into battle, and the state filled that void with certainty. Order number 270 did not merely condemn one man. It erased his family from society, turning a surname into proof of guilt. Kachalov is absent, yet the accusation controls everything. He would never surrender, his son would later say. I cannot pretend to know what it means to lose honor after death. The evening before departure did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived quietly with paperwork spread across a narrow desk and the steady scrape of pencil against paper. Lieutenant General Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov was 51 years old, and every night, without exception, he drew the same thing. A hand-sketched diagram of his units. Boxes for divisions. Lines for roads. Arrows adjusted and erased until the graphite smudged his fingers. It was a habit formed long before this war, long before the titles back, when mistakes cost men he could still name. That night, the lamp buzzed faintly. Outside the window, Arkhangelsk was already cooling the northern air pressing against the glass. Kachalov paused, flexed his hand, then continued writing notes in the margin. Ammunition estimates, march timing, gaps he did not like. He knew what the papers would not say aloud. This assignment had no reserve. Earlier in the evening, an operations officer stood across from him, cap tucked under one arm. The man was younger, careful with his words. Comrade Lieutenant General, he said, we are still short on radios. Only partial distribution. Kachalov did not look up right away. He finished the line he was drawing, then set the pencil down. How many working sets, he asked. Not enough for continuous contact, once we move west. Kachalov nodded once. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask who was responsible. He only reached for the map again and adjusted an arrow with his thumb. Then we move, knowing that he said, and we write everything down. The officer hesitated. Sir, the timetable is tight. It always is, Kachalov replied. When the door closed, the room felt larger. He pushed the papers aside and stood. From a wardrobe in the corner, he removed his ceremonial uniform. The fabric was heavier than field gear, dark and formal, with insignia that caught the light. He laid it carefully on the bed and folded it, smoothing the sleeves as if preparing it for inspection. He did not pack it. Instead, he set it aside. From a small leather case, he took out an old compass. The brass was dulled, the glass faintly scratched. Galicia, 1914. He had carried it through mud and shellfire, then learning how easily lines on a map could become graves. He placed the compass on the desk separate from everything else, and for a moment simply looked at it. There was a knock. Elena Kachalova entered quietly. She had lived through enough relocations to recognize this hour, this stillness before movement. Years earlier, during their last transfer between districts, she had sat by a window mending his coat, the needle catching light as trains passed below. She remembered that, now as she watched him stand by the desk. You're leaving at dawn, she said. Yes. She reached for the folded uniform. You're not taking this. No. She did not ask why. Instead, she adjusted the collar he wore, brushing away a trace of graphite from his cuff. Her fingers paused there. You'll write, she asked. When I can. She nodded, though both knew what that meant. Messages would be brief, routes uncertain, then nothing. Later, after she had gone, Kachalov sat again and opened a small notebook. Not orders, not reports. This one was private. He wrote slowly the way he always did, recording thoughts he did not say aloud. He wrote of the north of forests and long evenings, of the books he meant to return to when this was finished. Old military texts. Campaigns studied not for glory, but for mistakes. He closed the notebook without finishing the sentence. Before sleeping, he checked his watch, then the compass again. He placed it inside his field jacket. Outside, a vehicle engine coughed and went quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, boots moved, stopped, and moved again. Morning came thin and gray. There was bread, tea, already cooling, and a brief exchange of signatures. No speeches. No send-off. Kachalov stepped into the vehicle carrying only what he always did. Papers, the jacket, the compass, and the weight of a task he did not believe was properly equipped. As the convoy moved, he leaned forward, studying the road. Each mile west felt like subtraction. Radios lost, men reassigned, promises made too quickly. At a halt near the rail transfer point, one of his staff approached, breath fogging in the air. Sir, the man said, lowering his voice, we've been assembled faster than expected. Units from different districts. Some commanders don't know each other. Kachalov listened. We'll learn, he said. On the move. But the Germans I know, Kachalov cut in not sharply, just firmly. I know. He turned away before the sentence could finish. He did not need predictions. What concerned him was not the enemy's speed, but his own formation's thinness. A new army formed from remnants and transfers. No depth, no margin. That night, closer to the front, he repeated his routine. The same diagrams, the same pencil marks, the same care. He spoke briefly with another officer about fuel shortages, with a tank commander about terrain, with a courier who arrived late and left without staying. At one point, someone asked him if he wished to sleep. Later, he said, he folded his map, placed it under his hand, and rested his eyes without lying down. The smell of oil and damp canvas filled the space. Somewhere artillery sounded distant but steady. In those hours, he did not speak of fear, but it was there, precise and practical. Fear of losing cohesion. Fear of making a decision too late because information never arrived. Fear of being forced to choose between breaking out and holding ground without support. He thought of Elena's hands on his sleeve, of the compass pressing lightly against his chest. By the time Tupdoan Quan Hai Tam reached the area near Roslavl, the situation had already shifted. Orders arrived incomplete. Lines on maps no longer matched what scouts reported. Then the radios went quiet. No contact, no confirmation. Encirclement did not announce itself either. It revealed itself through absence. Units failing to report, roads suddenly occupied, messengers not returning. Kachalov stood by a burning vehicle and listened to the wind move through trees cut by shellfire. He gathered officers close, speaking quickly, precisely. Hold here. Move there. Destroy what cannot be taken, one of them asked. And headquarters Kachalov did not answer right away. We are headquarters, he said. That was the last normal sentence he would say. On the morning of August 4th, the air was sharp, smoke hung low. He removed his insignia and handed his uniform to an aide. Keep this, he said. Then he took a tank helmet and climbed into the vehicle, waiting nearby. The compass was still in his jacket. No one recorded his final orders. No staff officer survived to repeat them. There was only the movement forward, metal grinding engines roaring, and the knowledge clearer than any map that this attempt was all that remained. And when the tank advanced towards Starinka, Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov did not believe he was disappearing. He believed, as he always had, that if he stayed close enough to the line, something might still be held together. No message arrived to mark the moment when Tupdoan Quan Hai Tam ceased to exist as a formation that could be followed on paper. For Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov, the loss did not feel abstract. It came as weight. Radios that produced only static, couriers who never returned, maps that grew less truthful by the hour. He stood beside the road near Roslavl, boots sunk into soft ground churned by armor, listening to a field telephone that refused to carry a voice. The handset was warm in his palm, as if it remembered what it was meant to do. Try again, he told the signaler. The man turned the crank. Nothing changed. Kachalov handed the phone back without comment. He pulled his jacket tighter, the compass pressing against his ribs as he moved. The habit of checking bearings remained even when direction itself felt unreliable. West no longer meant the same thing it had days earlier. Encirclement did not arrive as a dramatic moment. It assembled itself from practical signs. A road held by unfamiliar uniforms. A column forced to turn back. Artillery heard from two directions, where only one had been expected. Each piece alone could be explained. Together they formed a boundary. Kachalov gathered what remained of his command group inside a half-collapsed structure. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood. A candle burned low on a crate. We move south by sections, he said, tracing lines on a torn map. Not all at once. Tanks first, infantry after. And if contact fails, one officer asked. It already has, Kachalov replied. We proceed anyway. He did not say what everyone knew. There would be no correction from above. No amended orders. No confirmation that this attempt mattered to anyone beyond the ring closing around them. By the second day, even internal communication thinned. Units fought as fragments led by whoever still stood. Kachalov moved constantly from one position to the next, speaking briefly, listening less. Not from arrogance, but because information arrived too late to be useful. A tank crew shouted to him over engine noise. "Fuel is low, then don't stop," he answered. At one point, he climbed a rise and looked out over a field marked by craters and burning vehicles. The heat from a wrecked truck rolled across him in waves. He smelled oil and scorched rubber. He forced himself to look long enough to understand where gaps might still exist. There was no time to record any of this, no ledger, no sketch. His nightly diagrams had ended when the pencil was lost and paper became a liability. Somewhere, far from Roslavl, Lev Meklis sat at a desk with clean paper and a pen dipped in red ink. He did not see the field. He did not smell burning fuel. What he saw instead were reports of retreat of formations failing to hold. He wrote quickly. His handwriting was sharp, decisive. He had learned that hesitation could be mistaken for sympathy, and sympathy could end a career. In his report, Kachalov became a problem to be explained, a commander who could not be reached, a name that stopped appearing in transmissions. Meklis underlined the gap and filled it with interpretation. He paused once, pen hovering. If he were dead, he muttered, someone would have said so. He wrote on. The report traveled faster than any courier could have. It arrived in Moscow without the dirt of Roslavl, without the sound of engines failing, without the image of a man climbing into a tank helmet first. It arrived clean. Back at the front, Kachalov learned nothing of this. His world had narrowed to decisions measured in minutes. He directed a counterfire here, a withdrawal there. He ordered documents burned, vehicles disabled. At dusk, an aide approached him, voice tight. "Sir, some believe you should move farther back, for safety." Kachalov looked at the man, then toward the sound of gunfire. "If I move back," he said, "who moves forward?" The aide said nothing. Night offered no cover. Flares turned fields white, then dark again. Kachalov slept sitting up for a few minutes at a time, helmet in his lap. He dreamed once of the north of water moving slowly under ice, then woke to shouting. By morning, only fragments remained under his immediate direction. He called them together near Starinka, choosing ground that offered a narrow chance. Tanks clustered. Infantry took positions wherever there was shadow. One of the officers asked him quietly, "Do you think they know where we are?" Kachalov adjusted the strap of his borrowed helmet. "They will," he said. "Soon." He removed the insignia from his jacket and handed it away. Not ceremonially. Practically. "If I fall," he told the aide, "burn the papers." There was no response to that, only a nod. The breakout attempt began without signal. Engines roared. Tracks bit into earth. Kachalov rode forward, body pressed against steel compass, unmoving against his chest. He felt each impact through the hull. He shouted directions no one could hear. Then the hit came. The explosion filled the interior with heat and pressure. Metal screamed. The world collapsed inward. There was no time for thought beyond the instinct to brace, to orient, to endure. When the tank stopped moving, it was already burning. What followed was not recorded by anyone present. German units secured the area later, checking wrecks, counting losses. In one tank, they found a body that did not match the rest. Older, different clothing beneath the protective gear. They identified him as a general. Orders were given. The body was removed. A separate grave was prepared. Villagers were compelled to help, watching from the edges of fear and exhaustion. They remembered the fire, the smell, the care with which the burial was done. None of this traveled back with the speed of Meklis's report. In Moscow, the absence of confirmation hardened into certainty of a different kind. Kachalov's name entered a document that would reshape his fate more completely than any shell. Order number 270 did not ask where he had fallen. It declared where he stood morally. It listed his name alongside others as if grouping were proof. When the decree was read aloud, it sounded final. Dulentab duan kwan haitam. Dafan boy. Kachalov could not hear it. Elena could. So could his children. At the front, Roslavl burned and moved on. The field near Starinka settled into ordinary earth. The grave remained, marked only in memory. Lev Meklis filed his report and moved to the next task. He did not revisit the question. For him, the danger had passed. For Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov, it had only begun. More than a decade later, Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov returned to the world not as a man, but as a question that refused to stay buried. The war had ended medals, redistributed graves, counted and recounted. Yet his name remained fixed inside a verdict that no longer aligned with the evidence slowly surfacing in locked rooms. In a narrow office lit by a single desk lamp, a military investigator in his early 40s worked after hours. He did this at night, when fewer eyes passed the corridor. German operational files lay open before him, their paper thin, their edges brittle. The smell of dust and old ink clung to his hands. He adjusted a small magnifying glass, a habit carried over from earlier archival work, and leaned closer. He was not looking for heroism. He was looking for confirmation. The files were orderly. Dates, coordinates, engagement summaries, prisoner counts. The investigator traced a finger down one page, then another. Names of captured commanders appeared with methodical precision. Each entry was stamped, cross-referenced, initialed. Kachalov did not appear. He checked again slower this time. He whispered the name under his breath, as if the paper might respond. Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov, he said quietly. Nothing. He turned to a different folder, this one labeled, with operations near Roslavl. Reports from the German Ninth Corps described heavy resistance, armored clashes, losses sustained, while sealing a pocket near a village called Starinka. One paragraph caught his attention. It mentioned the destruction of a command element, the elimination of a senior officer killed inside a tank during a breakout attempt. The investigator felt a tightening in his chest. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This was not proof, but it was direction. He knew what pursuing this meant. Order number 270 was not merely a document, it was a boundary. To cross it was to imply that the state had been wrong, and that implication carried weight. He closed the file and sat back. The chair creaked. Somewhere in the building, a radiator knocked, then settled. He thought of the men who had signed the decree of how certainty had been produced in the middle of collapse. If he was wrong, there would be consequences. Files had a way of turning on those who handled them. He reopened the folder. Over the following weeks, he built a narrow trail. No prisoner records, no interrogations, no transport lists. Every standard indicator of capture was missing. In their place were combat logs, describing intense fighting on the 4th day of August, 1941. Tanks destroyed. Resistance that surprised even seasoned units. The investigator marked passages with slips of paper. He did not make copies. He memorized page numbers. At home, sleep came poorly. He dreamed of pages dissolving in his hands, of ink running like water. In the mornings, he folded his newspaper carefully, hiding headlines that celebrated certainty. One evening, he stopped at a particular line and read it aloud quietly, as if testing its stability. Enemy general identified post-engagement. He closed his eyes. This was the first time in years that Kachalov felt closer to being located than accused. The investigator requested permission to pursue a field verification. The request was worded cautiously, framed as clarification rather than challenge. Days passed. Then approval came thin and conditional. Starinka was not marked prominently on any current map. When the investigation team arrived, the village was smaller than expected, its buildings uneven, its roads worn into habit rather than design. Autumn had settled in. The air carried the smell of damp soil and wood smoke. The investigator stepped out of the vehicle and adjusted his coat. He carried only a notebook, a pencil, and the magnifying glass, now wrapped in cloth. He did not announce the purpose of his visit broadly. He asked questions about the summer of 1941. At first, the answers were cautious. People measured him with their eyes before their words. Then one man, middle-aged at the time of the battle, nodded slowly. There was a tank, he said, burned all night. Another added, the Germans came after. They looked inside. The investigator listened without interrupting. He felt the weight of each sentence not as testimony yet, but as risk taken by those speaking. A farmer named Kuzmin described how the soldiers had ordered a separate burial, how they had stood back while the villagers dug, how the body had been treated differently. A General Kuzmin said, "They said so themselves." The investigator wrote nothing down at that moment. He looked instead at the ground where Kuzmin pointed. Grass grew there, now thin but persistent. He knelt and pressed his hand to the soil. It was cool, compacted by years. He imagined the heat that had once been here, the metal cooling, the smell that would have lingered. Back in his room that night, he allowed himself a single-spoken thought. So that is where you were. The next stage required authorization for exhumation. The paperwork moved slowly, as if reluctant. When permission came, it was accompanied by reminders of discretion. The grave was opened under overcast sky. The investigator stood at the edge, notebook closed, watching as the earth was removed layer by layer. No ceremony, only procedure. What emerged was fragmentary. Cloth remnants, buttons, bone. The forensic specialist spoke quietly, pointing out details. The investigator leaned in, magnifying glass in hand. He recognized the insignia fragments immediately. He had seen them before, in photographs attached to the original sentencing file. This was not imagination. It was alignment. The injuries told a coherent story. Trauma consistent with blast pressure in confined space. No signs of restraint. No evidence of execution. The investigator felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was taking shape. Dread at what that truth would demand next. He returned to Moscow with samples, reports, and a conclusion that could not be easily softened. Lieutenant General Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov had died in combat. The file was reopened. In a quiet corridor, he passed a man who had once signed off on the original verdict. Their eyes met briefly. Nothing was said. Later, alone again at his desk, the investigator placed the magnifying glass down and removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the final report. He thought of Kachalov not as a symbol, but as a man inside a tank making a decision when there were no clean options left. He wrote one sentence at the end of the file, careful and exact. Capture not substantiated. Death in action established. When he signed his name, his hand did not shake. For the first time since the decree, the shape of Kachalov's final hours was no longer defined by assumption. It was defined by evidence that had waited quietly in foreign archives and village soil, enduring until someone was willing to look long enough. The road to Starinka did not feel like a destination. It felt like a narrowing corridor, a passage where assumptions had to be shed one by one. For more than a decade, Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov had existed only as a sentence in a decree, his fate compressed into accusation. Now, the investigator understood that whatever remained of him would not declare itself. It would have to be approached carefully, without expectation, without haste. Starinka appeared smaller than its name suggested. A handful of houses, uneven fences, fields that had been plowed and replowed until their surfaces erased every violent memory. Nothing announced that a tank had burned here through the night, that men had shouted and died within meters of where chickens now scratched at the soil. The investigator stepped out of the vehicle and adjusted his coat against the wind. He wore no insignia. He carried only a notebook, a pencil, and the small magnifying glass wrapped in cloth that never left his pocket. He did not begin with authority. He began with listening. The villagers were cautious. Even now, memory carried risk. When he asked about the summer of 1940, answers came slowly, shaped by decades of habit. Some shook their heads. Some spoke of harvests interrupted of noise that came and went. Then, N.V. Kuzmin, standing slightly apart, spoke with more certainty. There was a tank, Kuzmin said. It burned all night. The investigator turned toward him, where Kuzmin lifted his hand and pointed beyond the edge of the village toward a gentle rise where grass grew thinner. They fought there, he said. Not like the others, hard. They walked together. The ground sloped gently, almost politely. Wind moved across it without resistance. Kuzmin stopped and placed his boot deliberately, as if testing alignment between memory and earth. This is where, he said. The investigator knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. It was compacted, dense, shaped by years of rain and frost. He imagined heat once trapped here, metal collapsing inward, pressure erasing breath. He wrote down coordinates. He did not speak. Permission for excavation arrived days later, accompanied by instructions that emphasized restraint. No announcements, no markings, only procedure. The work began early in the morning. The sound was controlled and repetitive shovel against earth pause adjustment. The investigator stood close, hands clasped behind his back. He had learned that impatience destroyed context. When the sound changed, he raised a hand. Careful. Shovels were set aside. Smaller tools appeared. Soil was brushed away by hand. The smell rose, gradually wet earth mixed with rust, and beneath it, something heavier, a scent that suggested old fire, sealed underground. The forensic specialist crouched low, brushing with deliberate precision. The first object to emerge was a button. It was larger than standard issue, its edges worn smooth. The investigator leaned in immediately, magnifying glass in hand. He did not need the emblem to recognize it. General Staff issue, he said quietly. The specialist nodded. Agreed. Around it lay fragments of fabric, brittle and blackened fibers fused as if exposed to intense heat. Beneath that layer, another cloth appeared heavier, more tightly woven. This was underneath, the specialist said. Ceremonial uniform. The investigator felt his chest tighten. He thought of a uniform folded carefully days before a breakout insignia removed and handed away. What had once sounded like anecdote now aligned with what the ground revealed. As excavation continued, bone structure emerged slowly. The forensic specialist explained each finding without embellishment. Fractures radiated outward from the torso. The rib cage showed compression consistent with blast overpressure. The spine bore stress patterns, characteristic of detonation within a confined space. Artillery, the specialist said. Close range. Inside a vehicle, the investigator added. Yes. They examined skull fragments. There were no marks indicating restraint. No secondary injuries suggesting capture. No signs of prolonged survival. The damage was immediate, overwhelming. Someone asked the question that had governed punishment for 12 years. Any indication of surrender? The specialist shook his head. None. No binding marks. No delayed trauma. Death was instantaneous. The investigator straightened slowly. For the first time, the accusation lost its footing. It could no longer stand against what lay exposed. Kuzmin stepped forward, voice low but steady. They opened the tank, he said. The Germans. The investigator looked at him. What did they say? They said General, Kuzmin replied. I heard it clearly. Then, they told us to dig. Not with the others. That detail mattered. The grave's position confirmed it. Even in enemy procedure, hierarchy had been observed. The investigator recorded this carefully. Memory aligned with placement. Placement aligned with evidence. Every item was catalogued. Buttons, fabric, bone. Measurements were taken, compared, cross-referenced. This was no longer belief. It was reconstruction. When documentation was complete, the excavation stopped. The site was left unmarked. Grass was pressed back into place. From a distance, nothing suggested that truth had surfaced there. That night, the investigator reviewed the findings alone. His hands still smelled faintly of soil. He did not wash them again. So this is where you ended, he said quietly. Back in Moscow, the report moved through channels that had once sealed Kachalov's fate. Injury patterns were matched with German artillery specifications. Uniform fragments were compared with archived regulations. Combat logs from the Ninth Corps were placed alongside forensic diagrams. Each step reinforced the same conclusion. Lieutenant General Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov had died in combat inside a tank during a breakout attempt near Starinka. The Supreme Military Court convened without ceremony. Judges who had once relied on assumption now faced coherence. The original sentence, one of them said, was issued without physical confirmation. Yes, the investigator replied. There was no body, no witness. And now? Now, there is both. Pens remained still. Pages were turned slowly. The verdict was annulled. The charge of treason removed. The correction was issued without commentary, without apology. The investigator left the chamber without triumph. Evidence had done its work. Yet the years between accusation and truth remained untouched by procedure. Outside, the city continued. Inside the file, Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov finally existed again, not as a traitor, not as rumor, but as a man whose final moments had been reconstructed from soil, metal, and memory. The truth had been established. What it would cost the living to receive it was still unresolved. The correction arrived without ceremony. No envelope stamped urgent. No uniformed escort. Just a folded document passed across a desk, its edges already soft from handling. Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov's son accepted it with both hands, a habit learned early when papers could decide where one was allowed to live, study, or disappear. He did not read it there. He carried it home through streets he had walked for decades, streets that had never fully accepted him. People passed without looking. Shop windows reflected a man older than he felt, shoulders held carefully, as if posture itself were a defense. The paper rested inside his coat, close to his chest. He could feel its weight with each step. Inside the apartment, he closed the door and stood still for a moment. The space was small, ordered, shaped by caution rather than comfort. On the wall above the table hung a clock old mechanical inherited. It ticked unevenly, always a fraction behind. It had belonged to his father. He placed the document on the table, but did not unfold it yet. Instead, he sat and listened to the clock. Tick, pause, tick. The sound filled the room more completely than silence ever had. When he finally opened the paper, he read slowly. He had learned to do that. Reading quickly left no room to recover. The language was restrained, almost careful. The sentence from 1941 was annulled. The charge of treason was removed. Lieutenant General Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov was declared to have died in combat. He read it again, then once more tracing his father's name with his finger, as if the letters might shift under pressure. So they finally wrote it down, he said quietly. The first feeling was not relief. It was disorientation. For most of his life, the accusation had been a fixed point around which everything else rotated. Schools, jobs, conversations that ended too early, invitations that never came. He had learned when to speak and when silence was safer. To have that center removed did not free him immediately. It left him momentarily unbalanced. Memory came next, sharp and uninvited. He was a boy again, standing near the door, while his mother held a document she did not read aloud. He remembered her hands, how tightly she folded the paper, how she told him not to repeat the word he had heard outside. He remembered the knock that came later, the questions asked too politely to be refused. That word had followed him into adulthood. Now it was missing. He leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. He noticed how his breathing changed, slower but uneven, as if his body were testing a new rhythm. From the drawer beneath the table, he took out a bundle of papers tied with string. He untied it carefully. Inside were fragments he had carried from place to place, without ever displaying them. Transfer notices, a photograph faded almost beyond recognition, a list of books written in a firm, compact hand. At the bottom lay a small object wrapped in cloth. The compass. He unwrapped it slowly. The brass casing was dulled edges, smoothed by use. The glass was scratched. He opened it and watched the needle tremble, then settle. It still worked. "They said you were inside a tank," he murmured, turning it gently in his palm. Earlier that day, the official had spoken plainly, as if clarity itself were an obligation. "He was killed inside the vehicle," the man said, leading the breakout. The son had waited before asking his question, measuring whether he wanted the answer. Did he panic? The official shook his head. "There's no indication of that." That answer stayed with him now. It mattered more than the court's language. He spent the afternoon walking the document folded inside his coat. The city moved around him, unchanged. He stopped once at a park bench and sat watching people pass. No one knew what had shifted. No one adjusted their steps because of a corrected sentence in an archive. He thought about his father not as a general, but as a presence remembered in fragments. The way he had checked his watch repeatedly, the smell of paper and pencil, the habit of drawing maps even when there was no map to draw, the promise once spoken about returning north, about quiet evenings and old books. Read the old ones, his father had said. They explain mistakes better. At a bookstore window, he paused briefly. Military histories lined the glass. He did not go inside. That evening, he returned home and placed the court decision inside the bundle of papers, retied the string, and returned it to the drawer. He took a blank sheet and wrote carefully, choosing each word. He did not surrender. He folded the paper and placed it beneath the clock. The clock ticked on. Days passed. Then, weeks. The document changed nothing immediately. No letters of apology arrived. No one knocked to say they had been wrong. The correction existed on paper, and nowhere else. At work, colleagues treated him as they always had, polite, distant, careful, not to ask. He did not announce anything. He did not carry the document with him anymore. He had learned that proof did not always protect. At home, he found himself returning often to the compass. He would take it out, open it, watch the needle steady. Direction still existed. That fact comforted him more than he expected. One night he sat at the table and spoke aloud, not loudly, not as a declaration. "Were you afraid?" he asked the empty room. The clock answered with its uneven rhythm. He imagined the inside of the tank not in detail, not with fire and noise, but as a confined space where decision replaced hesitation. He imagined his father choosing to stay forward because retreat would not hold. The question did not resolve, but it softened. What the court had returned was a word. What it could not return was time. Childhood reshaped by accusation, a mother's quiet endurance. A life lived in careful increments. Still something had shifted. For the first time, when he thought his father's name, it did not require defense. It did not arrive already wounded. Late that night, he placed the compass back into its cloth and set it beside the clock. Time and direction, both imperfect, both persistent. He turned off the light and sat briefly in the dark. The truth had come too late to change the past, but it had arrived early enough to change how he carried it. That he realized was not nothing. The reburial took place quietly, as if the land itself preferred restraint. Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov returned not to headlines, not to speeches, but to ground prepared in advance. The town of Stodolishe lay under a pale sky, the air cool enough to carry every sound without distortion. Footsteps on gravel, fabric shifting in the wind, breath. For years, those who had waited for him had waited without a place. His wife had died before this moment, carrying a certainty she was never allowed to prove. His children had grown up with a name that closed doors. Now there was finally a location where waiting could stop moving and become still. The coffin arrived early in the morning, plain wood, no excess. It was carried slowly, deliberately, as if speed might suggest carelessness. The son walked behind it, his steps measured, his hands empty. He did not carry flowers, he carried memory. A small group of people stood nearby. Some were officials. Others were locals who had learned the name only recently. A few were from Starinka, faces weathered, expressions guarded. They had kept something for years, without knowing what it would eventually become. One of them, Kuzmin, stood slightly apart. He removed his cap and held it against his chest. He remembered the tank burning through the night. He remembered being ordered to dig. He remembered how the Germans had spoken the word general with clarity. For him, this moment was not revelation. It was completion. The coffin was lowered slowly. Ropes creaked under weight. Soil weighted beside the grave, lighter than its Starinka, easier to turn. As it descended, the son stepped forward briefly. He placed his hand on the wood, felt its grain beneath his palm. "You're here now," he said quietly. There was no reply, only the sound of the coffin settling. As the earth was returned, the sound changed. The first shovel struck with a hollow note. Later, the sound softened, dampened by layers. The son listened closely, noticing how finality arrived not as a single moment, but as a gradual shift in tone. Around him, people watched without speaking. No one offered consolation. No one asked questions. This was not a moment for interpretation. When the grave was filled, a marker was placed. The name was engraved cleanly. Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov. Rank restored. Dates aligned. Nothing else. No mention of accusation. No trace of the word that had followed him for 12 years. The son stood for a long moment, after others began to drift away. He traced the letters with his eyes, then stepped back. For the first time, his father's name existed in a public space without distortion. Later in Starinka, the field remained unchanged. Grass grew where the tank had burned. Children crossed it without knowing why the soil felt firmer there. The villagers did not mark the spot. They did not need to. They knew. A small memorial would come later. Stone, metal, dates. But what mattered had already been carried through seasons without inscription. Memory had done its work when documents could not. The state corrected itself on paper. It restored rank. It removed charges. It renamed places. But it did not ask forgiveness. The absence of apology lingered noticeable, but unsurprising. What had been taken could not be returned by decree. Still, something endured. The son returned home after the reburial and placed the compass back into its drawer. He did not take it out as often now. He knew where it pointed. The clock above the table continued its uneven rhythm. Time had not healed. It had only moved. In Starinka, Kuzmin walked the edge of the field once more before winter. Frost pressed the ground hard. He stopped where the tank had been and stood there, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the air. "It's finished," he said to no one. But even as he spoke, he knew that was not entirely true. What remained of Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov was not only a corrected sentence or a restored name. It was the quiet endurance of those who had held the truth without protection. A son who learned too late, but learned fully. A village that remembered without writing anything down. At Stodoliche, snow began to settle on the marker. Letters filled slowly, then disappeared beneath white. The stone remained solid beneath the surface, waiting for spring. And somewhere between Starinka's field and that grave, between metal burned away and earth laid gently back the distance, between accusation and truth finally closed, not completely, not cleanly, but enough for one man to rest where he could be. Found. The file was closed, but Vladimir Yakovlevich Kachalov did not disappear back into paperwork. His name remained changed, but not simplified. It no longer carried the charge of betrayal, yet it also did not return to where it had once belonged. Correction does not reverse time. It only redraws its outline. Years after the marker was set at Stodoliche, his son still noticed how people paused before speaking the name. Not in suspicion anymore, but in uncertainty, as if they were unsure how to hold a truth that arrived so late. The compass lay in a drawer, now wrapped in cloth, no longer checked each evening. Direction had been restored, but habit lingered. People think truth fixes things, he once said quietly. It just changes what you have to live with. I can't pretend to know what it costs to grow up inside a verdict that later vanishes, to learn restraint before confidence, to inherit caution instead of stories. The state restored rank dates and geography. It renamed places, issued orders set stone. But it never accounted for the years when silence was safer than memory, when asking questions carried risk instead of answers. In Starinka, the field remains unmarked. Grass grows evenly where a tank once burned through the night. Children cross it without knowing why. The ground feels firmer in one place. The villagers never needed a sign. They had carried the knowledge when carrying it was dangerous, and released it only when someone finally asked the right way. At Stodoliche, the stone stands without explanation. A name, a rank, years aligned. Snow fills the letters in winter and melts again in spring. Nothing on the marker tells you what came before the correction or how long it took to arrive. That work is left to those who remember without inscription. Kachalov's story does not end with vindication. It ends with placement. A man returned from accusation to ground, from rumor to record. The distance between those points was measured not in kilometers, but in waiting. Waiting endured by a family that could not defend itself, by villagers who held their tongues, by evidence that lay buried until someone was willing to look. If there is an echo, it is not triumphant. It is restrained. It asks no applause. It lingers in the space between what the state can correct and what it cannot repair. Truth survives here not because it is powerful, but because it is patient. And somewhere beyond this story, other names remain suspended, still waiting for soil, for paper, for a witness willing to say quietly, "This is where it happened."